A limestone ridge runs along the western shore of the Dead Sea, bleached pale by centuries of salt wind. At its base, a fissure cuts diagonally through the rock face, narrow, dark, and deliberately overlooked on modern survey maps of the region. The stone around the opening is smooth on one side, rough on the other, as though something polished it by passing through repeatedly and then stopped. Animal tracks stop 6 meters from the entrance. Bird droppings stain the rocks to either side. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out. In 382 CE, the Roman Church under Pope Damasus I issued a canonical decree that excluded the Book of Jubilees from the authorized biblical list. The text was ordered removed from liturgical use across the empire. The reason was straightforward. It contained material that contradicted the approved narrative of Genesis. Bishops were instructed to collect and destroy existing copies. Within a century, the Hebrew originals had vanished from every library in the Roman world. Not misplaced, not archived, vanished. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd tracking a lost goat tossed a stone into a cave opening on the ridge above Qumran and heard the sound of pottery breaking. Inside Cave 1, he found jars stuffed with rolled scrolls. By 1956, 11 caves along that same ridge had yielded thousands of fragments, and among them were at least 14 separate copies of the Book of Jubilees. More copies of Jubilees were found at Qumran than copies of most books that made it into the Standard Bible. In 1964, the archaeologist Yigael Yadin recovered additional Jubilees fragments from the ruins at Masada, 40 kilometers south, confirming the text was in active circulation among Jewish communities well into the 1st century. The text the church had tried to erase had survived, sealed in dry desert stone for 2,000 years, exactly where someone had hidden it. The Book of Jubilees describes a sealed subterranean structure beneath the hills of the ancient world, a locked abyss where rebellious entities were bound in permanent confinement, where the text states explicitly that nothing confined there is permitted to leave. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says about what was sealed beneath those hills, what evidence shows about how the passage was removed from circulation, and why it was hidden from the biblical record you know today. If ancient sealed chambers and forbidden texts fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The most complete version of Jubilees survived in Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the only Christian tradition that never removed it from its Bible. The first critical English translation was produced by R.H. Charles in 1895, working from Ethiopic manuscripts held at the British Museum and the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Charles noted in his introduction that the Ge'ez text preserved readings that matched the Hebrew fragments found at Qumran with what he called remarkable fidelity. The Qumran fragments are catalogued under designations 1Q17, 1Q18, 4Q176A, 4Q176B, 4Q216, 4Q218, 4Q223 through 4Q224, and 11Q12. Fragment 4Q216 contains portions of what corresponds to Jubilees chapter 5. Fragment 11Q12, recovered from Cave 11 in 1956, contains lines matching chapter 10. James Vanderkam, of the University of Notre Dame, published the definitive critical edition of the Qumran Jubilees fragments in 1994 through the Discoveries in the Judean Desert Series, Volume 13. His analysis confirmed that the Hebrew text underlying the Ge'ez translation was stable across at least a millennium of transmission. The passages about confinement were not additions. They were not later insertions. They were present in the oldest surviving copies, the Ge'ez manuscripts held in Ethiopian monasteries, some dating to the 14th century, copied from earlier exemplars no longer extant, contain the same passages, word for word, that the Qumran Hebrew fragments preserve. The text was not altered over time. It was not edited to add drama. The description of the sealed cavity beneath the hills was there from the beginning, and this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into three parts. The first part is in Jubilees chapter 5, verses 6 through 11. The passage describes the aftermath of what the text calls the corruption of the Watchers, angelic beings who, according to the narrative, descended to earth and violated their assigned order. The text states that these beings were bound in the depths of the earth forever, until the day of the great judgment. The Hebrew word used in the Qumran fragments for their location is one associated with subterranean confinement, not a prison above, not a dimension elsewhere, a place below the surface of the ground. Chapter 5, verse 10 specifies that no eye should see them again. The phrasing is unusual. It does not say they were destroyed. It does not say they were cast out. It does not say they were removed from existence. It says they were placed somewhere, permanently, where they could not be seen. Verse 11 of the same chapter extends the confinement to their offspring, described as entities that go into the abode of the dead and descend into the place of condemnation and into the darkness of the deep. Three phrases stacked in sequence, each one spatial: an abode, a place; a darkness, not states of being; locations. The second part appears in Jubilees chapter 10, verses 1 through 9. The text introduces a figure named Mastema, described as a chief among the confined entities, granted limited authority to retain a fraction of his subordinate spirits on the surface. Chapter 10, verse 8 records a command to imprison them and hold them fast in the place of condemnation. Verse 9 states that 9 parts of the spirits were ordered to descend into the place of condemnation, while 1 part was permitted to remain before Mastema. The text uses the phrase place of condemnation as a proper noun, not a concept, not a metaphor, but a specific location with a name. The proportions are exact: 9 parts confined, 1 part released. The text records the ratio as though it were a logistical decision, a number agreed upon and enforced. A separate passage, preserved in the same Ge'ez manuscripts, describes the destination as the darkness of the deep and the abode of the dead. The language throughout is spatial. Directions are given, proportions are specified, boundaries are defined. This reads like a record of a transfer of prisoners to a facility, not a theological abstraction. The text even specifies that the remaining 1/10 operate under Mastema's direct supervision, restricted to specific functions: accusing, testing, and afflicting, which are listed in chapter 10, verse 8, as though they were operational assignments rather than spiritual tendencies. The third part is scattered across chapters 4, 7, and 48. References to geographic locations where these confinements were established. Chapter 7 references the valleys associated with the Watcher descent. Chapter 4 mentions specific hill regions tied to the earliest generations. Chapter 48 references the darkness that Moses is protected from during the plagues. A darkness described in Jubilees not as weather, but as an existing condition tied to a place, something already present beneath the surface that was temporarily allowed to manifest. Together, these references place the sealed structure in identifiable terrain: hills, valleys, and ridgelines in the ancient Near East. The text treats these locations as known. It does not introduce them. It does not explain where they are. It assumes the reader already knows. In 2018, the Deep Carbon Observatory, an international research consortium involving scientists from 50 countries, published the results of a 10-year study of Earth's deep subsurface. The findings, summarized in a report released through the University of South Wales, estimated that Earth's crust contains approximately 23 billion tons of microorganisms living in rock cavities kilometers below the surface. These organisms exist in total darkness, without sunlight, without oxygen, in conditions that were previously assumed to be sterile. The study found that roughly 70% of Earth's total microbial mass lives underground, not on the surface, not in the oceans, but inside the rock itself. Dr. Karen Lloyd of the University of Tennessee, one of the project's lead researchers, stated in the 2018 report that this deep biosphere constitutes a massive ecosystem beneath our feet that we know almost nothing about. She described environments where microbial communities had been isolated from the surface for tens of millions of years. Sealed in rock, surviving on chemical energy alone, unchanged since the time the rock itself was formed. The New York Times, reporting on the findings in June 2024, described these deep-dwelling organisms as entities that sculpt our planet from beneath, operating in cavities and fractures that remain completely disconnected from the surface world. The parallel is structural, not thematic. Jubilees describes sealed cavities beneath the hills, containing entities that do not interact with the surface. The Deep Carbon Observatory confirmed that sealed cavities beneath the surface of the Earth exist, contain life, and have been isolated from the surface for timescales that dwarf human history. The description in Jubilees and the description in the 2018 report share the same structural elements: a cavity, sealed, beneath the surface, containing life forms that do not emerge. Here's what the translators left out. In R.H. Charles's 1895 English edition of Jubilees, Chapter 5, Verse 6, the phrase describing the watcher's confinement is rendered as bound in the depths of the earth. The Ge'ez word used in the source manuscripts, the word Charles chose to translate as depths, appears again in chapter 10, verse 8, but there Charles translated it differently. In that chapter, he rendered the same word as place of condemnation. The Hebrew equivalent, preserved in fragment 4Q216, carries the root meaning of a physical enclosed space, a hollow, a cavity, a chamber cut into rock. The word does not mean depth in an abstract sense. It does not mean condemnation in a moral sense. It means a sealed cavity below the surface. Charles, working in Victorian England with limited comparative material, translated the same structural term two different ways in two different chapters. And in doing so, he split one physical description into two unrelated concepts. The Qumran Hebrew fragments, which Charles did not have access to in 1895, confirm that the same word is used in both passages. The text is describing one structure, not a theological idea, a place, a sealed cavity beneath the hills, with a door that does not open. When Vanderkam published the Hebrew fragments in 1994, he noted in his commentary that the repeated use of the same root across chapters 5 and 10 indicated a consistent spatial reference, a single location referenced across multiple chapters. Charles never had that information. His readers never had it. And because his translation became the standard English edition, used in universities and seminaries for over a century, the reading split was never corrected in the version most people actually read. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea, approximately 363 CE. The Council's canonical decree, Canon 60, listed the books permitted for reading in churches. Jubilees was not on the list. By 382 CE, Pope Damasus I had formalized the exclusion through a decree circulated to bishops across the Roman Empire. Jerome of Stridon, commissioned by Damasus to produce the Latin Vulgate, was aware of Jubilees. He references it in his writings on Genesis, but he declined to translate it. In a letter dated approximately 384 CE, Jerome described certain non-canonical works as containing material not fitting for the ears of the simple. He did not name Jubilees in that letter. He did not have to. The directive from Damasus was sufficient. By the early 5th century, the text had been removed from liturgical use in every major Christian center: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch. The Greek copies disappeared. The Latin copies were never made. Athanasius of Alexandria, in his 367 CE Easter letter, listed books he considered canonical and books he considered not to be read. Jubilees appeared on neither list, placed instead into a category he described as apocrypha, works that existed but were not to be copied, not to be discussed, not to be taught. The effect was total erasure within the Greek-speaking church. Only in the Ethiopian highlands, beyond the reach of Roman ecclesiastical authority, did the Ge'ez translation continue to be copied, read, and preserved. Century after century, in monasteries cut into the walls of the same kind of rock the text describes. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2019, a joint archaeological team from the Israel Antiquities Authority and a European university applied for a research permit to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys along a specific section of the Qumran Ridge, the area between Cave 4 and Cave 11, where the greatest concentration of Jubilees fragments was recovered. The permit was denied. The official reason cited was environmental sensitivity. The ridge is within a protected zone. But the same permit board had approved 4 other survey applications for adjacent sections of the same ridge in the previous 2 years, including seismic surveys within 200 meters of the denied application site. The denied applications specifically proposed scanning for subterranean cavities below the ridge. In 2021, a second application was filed, this time by an independent geophysical team, not affiliated with any biblical studies program. That permit was also denied. No further explanation was provided. The area between Cave 4 and Cave 11 remains unsurveyed. The ridge sits there, unscanned, its interior unmapped, while every other section of the Qumran cliff face has been documented, photographed, and published in peer-reviewed journals. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying there are sealed beings physically trapped in a cave beneath the Qumran Ridge. I'm not saying the Book of Jubilees is a blueprint to a door that someone could find and open. I'm not saying the permit denials are part of an organized campaign to hide a subterranean structure from the public. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a physical structure, a sealed cavity beneath a ridge, housing entities that do not emerge, in a location near where the oldest surviving copies of that text were hidden. And the text was removed from every Bible in the Western world within a century of its being written. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the Book of Jubilees describes a sealed subterranean structure beneath specific hills, and the Qumran fragments confirm that this description existed in the oldest Hebrew copies, and the text was ordered removed from circulation by Roman ecclesiastical authority within 3 centuries of its composition, and the only surviving complete version was preserved in a tradition that never fell under that authority, and modern subsurface research has confirmed that sealed cavities beneath the Earth's surface can contain isolated life forms unchanged for tens of millions of years. Then what the Book of Jubilees describes is not theology. It is documentation. A record, written by people who treated the location as known, of a place beneath the ground that was sealed. That is the simplest explanation that fits every piece of evidence in the chain. The limestone ridge still runs along the western shore of the Dead Sea. The fissure at its base is still narrow, still dark, still unmarked on modern maps. The salt wind still bleaches the stone pale. Animal tracks still stop 6 meters from the entrance. It is still there, still sealed, exactly the way Jubilees said it would be.